Novel Stream presents Novel of the Iron Maid by Machen. I think the most extraordinary event which I can recall took place about 5 years ago. I was then still feeling my way. I had declared for business and attended regularly at my office, but I had not succeeded in establishing a really profitable connection, and consequently I had a good deal of leisure time on my hands. I have never thought fit to trouble you with the details of my private life. They would be entirely devoid of interest. I must briefly say, however, that I had a numerous circle of acquaintance, and was never at a loss as to how to spend my evenings. I was so fortunate as to have friends in most of the ranks of the social order. There is nothing so unfortunate, to my mind, as a specialized circle, wherein a certain round of ideas is continually traversed and retraversed. I have always tried to find out new types and persons whose brains contain something fresh to me. One may chance to gain information even from the conversation of city men on an omnibus. Amongst my acquaintance, I knew a young doctor who lived in a far outlying suburb, and I used often to brave the intolerably slow railway journey to have the pleasure of listening to his talk. One night we conversed so eagerly together over our pipes and whiskey that the clock passed unnoticed, and when I glanced up I realized with a shock that I had just 5 minutes in which to catch the last train. I made a dash for my hat and stick, and jumped out of the house and down the steps, and tore at full speed up the street. It was no good, however. There was a shriek of the engine whistle, and I stood there at the station door and saw far on the long dark line of the embankment a red light shine and vanish, and a porter came down and shut the door with a bang. "How far to London?" I asked him. "A good 9 miles to Waterloo Bridge," and with that he went off. Before me was the long suburban street, its dreary distance marked by rows of twinkling lamps, and the air was poisoned by the faint, sickly smell of burning bricks. It was not a cheerful prospect by any means, and I had to walk through 9 miles of such streets, deserted as those of Pompeii. I knew pretty well what direction to take, so I set out wearily, looking at the stretch of lamps vanishing in perspective. And as I walked, street after street branched off to right and left, some far-reaching to distances that seemed endless, communicating with other systems of thoroughfare, and some mere protoplasmic streets, beginning in orderly fashion with serried 2-storied houses, and ending suddenly in waste and pits and rubbish heaps, and fields whence the magic had departed. I have spoken of systems of thoroughfare, and I assure you that, walking alone through these silent places, I felt fantasy growing on me and some glamour of the infinite. There was here, I felt, an immensity as in the outer void of the universe. I passed from unknown to unknown, my way marked by lamps like stars, and on either hand was an unknown world where myriads of men dwelt and slept, street leading into street, as it seemed to world's end. At first the road by which I was traveling was lined with houses of unutterable monotony, a wall of gray brick pierced by 2 stories of windows, drawn close to the very pavement. But by degrees I noticed an improvement. There were gardens, and these grew larger. The suburban builder began to allow himself a wider scope, and for a certain distance each flight of steps was guarded by twin lions of plaster, and scents of flowers prevailed over the fume of heated bricks. The road began to climb a hill, and, looking up a side street, I saw the half-moon rise over plane trees, and there on the other side was as if a white cloud had fallen, and the air around it was sweetened as with incense. It was a May tree in full bloom. I pressed on stubbornly, listening for the wheels and the clatter of some belated hansom. But into that land of men who go to the city in the morning and return in the evening, the hansom rarely enters, and I had resigned myself once more to the walk, when I suddenly became aware that someone was advancing to meet me along the sidewalk. The man was strolling rather aimlessly, and though the time and the place would have allowed an unconventional style of dress, he was vested in the ordinary frock coat, black tie, and silk hat of civilization. We met each other under the lamp, and as often happens in this great town, 2 casual passengers brought face to face found each in the other an acquaintance. "Mr. Mathias, I think," I said, Quite so. And you are Frank Burton. You know you are a man with a Christian name, so I won't apologize for my familiarity. But may I ask where you are going? I explained the situation to him, saying I had traversed a region as unknown to me as the darkest recesses of Africa. I think I have only about 5 miles farther, I concluded. Nonsense, you must come home with me. My house is close by. In fact, I was just taking my evening walk when we met. Come along. I dare say you will find a makeshift bed easier than a 5-mile walk. I let him take my arm and lead me along, though I was a good deal surprised at so much geniality from a man who was, after all, a mere casual club acquaintance. I suppose I had not spoken to Mr. Mathias half a dozen times. He was a man who would sit silent in an armchair for hours, neither reading nor smoking, but now and again moistening his lips with his tongue and smiling queerly to himself. I confess he had never attracted me, and on the whole I should have preferred to continue my walk. But he took my arm and led me up a side street and stopped at a door in a high wall. We passed through the still moonlit garden, beneath the black shadow of an old cedar, and into an old red brick house with many gables. I was tired enough, and I sighed with relief as I let myself fall into a great leather armchair. You know the infernal grit with which they strew the sidewalk in those suburban districts. It makes walking a penance, and I felt my 4-mile tramp had made me more weary than 10 miles on an honest country road. I looked about the room with some curiosity. There was a shaded lamp which threw a circle of brilliant light on a heap of papers lying on an old brass-bound secretaire of the last century, but the room was all vague and shadowy, and I could only see that it was long and low, and that it was filled with indistinct objects which might be furniture. Mr. Mathias sat down in a second armchair and looked about him with that odd smile of his. He was a queer-looking man, clean-shaven, and white to the lips. I should think his age was something between 50 and 60. Now I have got you here, he began, I must inflict my hobby on you. You knew I was a collector. Oh, yes, I have devoted many years to collecting curiosities which I think are really curious, but we must have a better light. He advanced into the middle of the room and lit a lamp which hung from the ceiling, and as the bright light flashed round the wick, from every corner and space, there seemed to start a horror. Great wooden frames with complicated apparatus of ropes and pulleys stood against the wall. A wheel of strange shape had a place beside a thing that looked like a gigantic gridiron. Little tables glittered with bright steel instruments carelessly put down as if ready for use. A screw and vise loomed out, casting ugly shadows, and in another nook was a saw with cruel jagged teeth. Yes, said Mr. Mathias, they are, as you suggest, instruments of torture and death. Some many, I may say, have been used. A few are reproductions after ancient examples. Those knives were used for flaying. That frame is a rack and a very fine specimen. Look at this. It comes from Venice. You see that sort of collar, something like a big horseshoe. Well, the patient, let us call him, sat down quite comfortably, and the horseshoe was neatly fitted round his neck. Then the two ends were joined with a silken band, and the executioner began to turn a handle connected with the band. The horseshoe contracted very gradually as the band tightened, and the turning continued till the man was strangled. It all took place quietly in one of those queer garrets under the leads. But these things are all European. The Orientals are, of course, much more ingenious. These are the Chinese contrivances. You have heard of the heavy death. It is my hobby, this sort of thing. Do you know, I often sit here, hour after hour, and meditate over the collection. I fancy I see the faces of the men who have suffered, faces lean with agony and wet with sweats of death growing distinct out of the gloom, and I hear the echoes of their cries for mercy. But I must show you my latest acquisition. Come into the next room. I followed Mr. Mathias out. The weariness of the walk, the late hour, and the strangeness of it all made me feel like a man in a dream. Nothing would have surprised me very much. The second room was as the first, crowded with ghastly instruments, but beneath the lamp was a wooden platform and a figure stood on it. It was a large statue of a naked woman, fashioned in green bronze. The arms were stretched out, and there was a smile on the lips. It might well have been intended for a Venus, and yet there was about the thing an evil and a deadly look. Mr. Mathias looked at it complacently. "Quite a work of art, isn't it?" he said. "It's made of bronze, as you see, but it has long had the name of the Iron Maid. I got it from Germany, and it was only unpacked this afternoon. Indeed, I have not yet had time to open the letter of advice. You see that very small knob between the breasts? Well, the victim was bound to the maid, the knob was pressed, and the arms slowly tightened round the neck. You can imagine the result." As Mr. Mathias talked, he patted the figure affectionately. I had turned away, for I sickened at the sight of the man and his loathsome treasure. There was a slight click of which I took no notice. It was not much louder than the tick of a clock, and then I heard a sudden whir, the noise of machinery in motion, and I faced round. I have never forgotten the hideous agony on Mathias's face as those relentless arms tightened about his neck. There was a wild struggle as of a beast in the toils, and then a shriek that ended in a choking groan. The whirring noise had suddenly changed into a heavy droning. I tore with all my might at the bronze arms and strove to wrench them apart, but I could do nothing. The head had slowly bent down, and the green lips were on the lips of Mathias. Of course, I had to attend at the inquest. The letter which had accompanied the figure was found unopened on the study table. The German firm of dealers cautioned their client to be most careful in touching the Iron Maid, as the machinery had been put in thorough working order. Thank you for listening.